And so moving on in the next section in Being and Time, what I want to focus on is just this one next section here, section 33, assertion as a derivative mode of interpretation. And just to recap his theory of interpretation then, understanding, as he had said, understanding basically is global, whereas interpretation is local rather. Understanding, I have a basic understanding of the town that I'm in and of my surroundings. I have an understanding of how things fit together and how they relate to each other. But if I want to focus on something specific, if I want to interpret something specific, then I interpret it as a door, or this thing as a carriage, or this thing as a bridge, or this thing as a book. Interpretation is specific and local, but my understanding of my world around is environmental. But interpretation is also, in terms of its hermeneutic as, what Heidegger calls the hermeneutic as, interpretation sees the web of the totality of involvements in the ready-to-hand mode of things. There's a totality of interrelations and involvements that I see when I interpret something. And so interpretation is pre-linguistic. I don't even need to make assertions about something in order to interpret it. Interpretation is something that we do on a daily basis. It's what Heidegger calls circumspective interpretation. It's common, everyone does it, and we have to do it in order to orient ourselves in our world environment. If a scientist is going on the way, if a scientist wants to make assertions in language, first he has to find his way to the library. He has to be able to recognize the library as a library. He has to be able to recognize books as books within that library, and so forth. So he has to do all this basic everyday hermeneutical as interpreting as he's constantly going about his business. Now, with respect to assertion then, if I make assertions about something, then I shift my interpretation into words. I shift it into discourse. And you can imagine in your minds, Heidegger gives this paradigm where he says, take the assertion that the hammer is heavy. So we can imagine a blacksmith in his workshop. You can imagine two different scenarios. One in which he says, he picks up the hammer and he says, this hammer is heavy, give me another one, to his assistant. That's an assertion. That's shifted into the realm of language now. But in another scenario where he simply picks it up, feels its weight, knows that it's heavy, sets it aside and grabs another one, that would be a pre-linguistic interpretation, or an average everyday circumspective interpretation. He just picks it up, and as Heidegger says, words are not necessary, language is not necessary in order for an interpretation to take place. But when words are necessary, let's say that the blacksmith has picked up the hammer and now he says, this hammer is too heavy, what's going on there? And Heidegger says in the making of an assertion, three things are going on. And the word that he uses for assertion is Aussage. And by assertion, he means that these are the kinds of assertions that we make in our average everyday world, not the kinds of assertions necessarily that are made in philosophy. Aussage are assertions made ontically of beings, but not ontologically of being. For that, Sagen is required, a different level of discourse. So what's going on then? What's going on are three things in an assertion. One is that the assertion points something out. And in pointing something out, it does not point to a meaning. It points to the entity itself and indicates that it exists in a certain way of being in its readiness to hand. The hammer is heavy points to the entity itself of the hammer being heavy, not to some meaning. It doesn't point to a Vorstellung, a representation, or to some psychological state. It points out the entity itself. But the second aspect of what an assertion does is that it predicates. It predicates something of a subject. And in this predication, a couple of things take place. First of all, a predication narrows down. It's much more narrow than what had taken place in the mere pointing out of an entity. Now we're narrowing it down and giving it a character. The predicate gives to the subject a certain character, a certain mode that characterizes it, and in doing so narrows its attributes. We're concerned now in the heaviness of the hammer, not with all the other attributes that the hammer has, but specifically with this one attribute of its heaviness. So we've narrowed the attributes down. And also, in addition to predicating of the hammer that it's heavy, the process of making this assertion about it also dims other entities down around it. They dim down so that we focus on this one entity, the hammer, which now shifts into our field of view and becomes the object of our circumspective concern now. And so other entities are dimmed down. So it's a narrowing takes place in the predication process. And then the third aspect that an assertion does is that it communicates something. It makes it possible to share this aspect that I have predicated of the hammer with other people. And they don't even have to be present in order for this to happen. They can hear by hearsay that the hammer is heavy. It can spread from the blacksmith shop, say, down the street, that the blacksmith needs a new hammer. His hammer is heavy. So they hear by hearsay, and they're seeing as, by that hearsay, they're seeing as extended to share with me what I have said and stated about the hammer. And so these are the three aspects that go along with making an assertion, and it is a mode of interpretation in which the three aspects of forehaving, foresight, and foreconception are also present in these modes. I have to, as a blacksmith, I have to know about my blacksmith world. I forehave a certain set of biases, and my foresight, the hammer, has to be in my sight. It has to be in my central site of concern, and I have to have the very concept of the hammer itself in order to make any statements about it. Let's say if I don't have the concept of a violin, I can recognize it as an implement maybe, but I can't recognize it as a violin. So the concepts, you have to forehave certain concepts in order to make certain statements at all about things. And so what then happens? Heidegger goes into a very interesting and important exegesis here about what happens in the shift from circumspective interpretation, which involves the hermeneutic as, seeing something as something, and in its context of total web of interreferentiality, to seeing, to making an assertion. Something happens in our, as he puts it, something happens in our forehaving when we say that, when we begin to make the assertion about the hammer. Something happens in terms of the ontology of the whole thing begins to shift in our forehaving, so that something with which we are to have something to do now becomes something about which we are going to make an assertion. And in that about which, my foresight now begins to focus on something that is present at hand within the readiness to hand of the hammer. So now I'm focusing, when I make the assertion, my foresight is focusing on a present at hand aspect of the hammer, namely a theoretical aspect about the properties that it has. And as a result of that, the readiness to hand of it becomes veiled. In shifts. So there's a Gestalt shift, actually, that goes on in our perception there, as would a later philosopher would put it, Fritz Perls. There's a Gestalt shift that happens there. It shifts out of the readiness to hand mode into the present at hand mode, and it becomes visible to me in the process of making these assertions about it. And in doing that, the as changes. We shift in doing that. The hermeneutic as changes to what Heidegger calls an apophantic as in the making of the assertion itself. The hermeneutic as can be pre-linguistic, as we have already seen, and it recognizes something, anything that I recognize around me, as part of a web, a totality of involvements that gives it its sense. That's no longer the case now. Now I'm carving the object out into a present at hand, purely theoretical mode when I make an assertion about it, and it shifts into an apophantic as. And the apophantic comes from Aristotle, who says that assertions are apophantic, meaning that they show something forth, related to phenine, something that shows something forth. So now it shows something forth about itself. It's apophantic now that it has entered into the realm of assertions and discourse and language. And also in doing that, it has been cut off from the web of interrelations, and now it is shifted into a mode of discourse where now the possibility of truth or untruth now becomes an issue. It can be, when the apophantic as can make a statement about something that might be true or might not be true, and it's part of the realm of discourse to wrestle that out, to wrestle out these properties in the present at hand mode from their concealment, and once they are wrestled out, they have to be defended, as it were, within the realm of assertions, within the realm of thought as well. And so there's this ontological shift. We have this ontological shift then when we make assertions from the hermeneutic as to the apophantic as into the realm of assertion. And now we're into the realm of language, and different rules apply than they do in merely making circumspective interpretation that orient us on a daily basis in our particular world round in a certain way. And then Heidegger goes into the apophantic as and its relationship to the logos, but I'm not going to go into that right now. The apophantic as, though, will have consequences for temporality. Later on, it will have to do with the horizontal schema for the temporality of past, present, and future in the mode of present at hand. So it will raise other implications later. So now he's moving into the realm of discourse now. So this bit by bit, he's moving into the realm of human interpretation, from understanding to interpretation to assertion. Now we're into the realm of human discourse, which we'll discuss next, discourse and language.